So we are on page 247, question number 70, looking at a double bar graph that shows the new registration of New Zealand cars from 1996 to 2008. So the double bar graph, we just have to be a bit careful about how it actually shows us the data. So the total length of the bar is the sum of both the X overseas and the new cars. So the height that the bar reaches in the end, that's the total number of cars. So if we want to find out how many of them are X overseas, we have to take the total minus the new to figure out what it is. So if we look at an example here, estimate the total number of newly registered cars classified as X overseas in 2004. So we'll look at 2004. So we want X overseas, that's the white part. So let's find the total amount. That's pretty close to 225,000. So we make estimations here. And the new cars, they come in roughly at 75,000. So those are two easy points on the graph to read for us. So to figure out the number of X overseas vehicles, we subtract those two numbers, and we have 150,000 of them are actually X overseas vehicles. The terms new and X overseas, what do they represent? Well, new is a new car, and X overseas is an imported used car, so typically less expensive. In 2003, what portion of the newly registered cars were imports? So they want to know a portion here. That really means fraction. So in 2003, we need to figure out the part over the total. So if we're making a fraction, always part over total. So the total in this case for 2003 is still roughly 225,000. And the number of new cars here, it's a little bit less, so maybe we'll round down to 70,000. So if we subtract the total minus the new, this will give us our our imports. So that comes out to be 155,000. So 155,000 of the 225,000 are going to be X overseas vehicles, or our imported vehicles. So to get our answer, we make the fraction 155,000 all over 225,000, and that gives us 0.62. And that's the actual answer they're looking for, 0.62. Again, a portion or a fraction. Part D, in 2008, how many newly registered cars were actually new? So here they want to know the new cars. So we look at 2008, and we can just read that gray part of the graph. We don't have to figure out the total, because that portion right there, that 75,000, tells us exactly how many new cars there were. So 75,000 new cars. Describe the trend in imported cars since 1999. Okay, so if we look at the imported cars from 1999, let's take a look at what happens. We see the total number of vehicles increases, then stays sort of steady, then sort of steady but decreased, and steady but decreased again, so stepping down each of those times. But remember, the height of the graph is telling us the total number of cars, and they want to know, describe the trend in the imported cars, so only the length of the white part. So we need to kind of make a comparison here. What's happening with these new cars? Relatively constant, and then relatively constant again. So the value of the new cars, the amount of new cars, doesn't really change very much. So we can kind of assume that it stayed the same and just talk about what we see the size of the white bar doing. So in this case, we could say something like from 2000 to 2003, we see an increase in the number of imported cars. So 2000 to 2003, increase in imports. Then from 2003 through to 2005, if we look at that graph again, we actually see it's relatively stable, it's steady, it doesn't really change. So that would be the trend we would describe. The number of imports is relatively stable. And then what happens? From 2005 down to 2006, there's a decrease. So 2005 to 2006, 2006, a decrease in imports. And for 2006 to 2007, again we see steady value. It's a relatively flat graph at that point between 2006 and 2007. And we notice the new cars are stable as well, so the size of that white part stays the same. And finally in 2008 we see a big step down again. So from 2007 to 2008, decrease in imports. So literally just talking about what we see in the graphs. So from 2005 until 2008, the number of ex-overseas cars dropped by 40%, while the number of new cars stayed almost the same. We saw that, again, the pink line coming down and the green line staying constant. So they want us to give a possible reason for this. It's very much a social studies kind of question, not so much a maths one, but if we thought of reasons why, ex-overseas cars, which are imported to us, are typically less expensive, whereas the new cars are brand new and more expensive. So because the imported cars are less expensive, we would expect that maybe in an economic downturn, the people who are buying the cheaper cars are more affected and they can't buy as many of them, so we import less of them. But in an economic downturn, the businesses and individuals that typically buy the more expensive cars are usually unaffected by the downturn. So the people who have more wealth are typically less affected by an economic downturn. So the number of new cars, the more expensive ones, will stay relatively steady in an economic downturn compared to the less expensive cars, which will probably decrease because the poorer people are worse affected by an economic downturn.